Dr. Benadusi, and in this video we are covering the skin, and let's start by looking at this model. So the first thing you need to notice is that in this model we see hair. Consequently, this has to be thin skin, and thin skin is characterized by having only 4 layers in the epidermis. Thick skin is thicker, and then it has 5 layers in the epidermis, but thick skin does not have hair. When we look in this model, we see that this is the epidermis, all this is the epidermis, and then below the epidermis, obviously we have the dermis, right? Epi, the root epi means above, so the epidermis is above the dermis. And then when you look down here, we see adipose tissue, we see adipocytes, and this is part of the hypodermis. Now the hypodermis is not part of our skin. Guys, the hypodermis is the same thing as the subcutaneous, the subcu. And subcutaneous means that it's below the cutaneous layer, right? Because the root sub is below. So the subcutaneous layer, which has the adipocytes, is below the cutaneous layer, which is made up by the epidermis and the dermis. So let's focus now in the epidermis of this model. This epidermis, since we see hair, we only have 4 layers. And the bottom layer, the layer at the base, is the stratum basale. And we know that these cells in the stratum basale, they are like melanocytes, and we also have keratinocytes, stem cells, and lots of keratinocytes. Now the keratinocytes, stem cells, they can divide, and as they divide, they will push older keratinocytes up, and when that happens, we have these cells moving towards the surface of our skin. So we have here the stratum basale, and then the following layer of cells is what we call stratum spinosum. And then you see that more or less at this level right here, these cells start getting more rounded. And these rounded cells, some of them don't even have nucleus in it. And we see some granules inside. Now, this layer right here is characterized by cells undergoing apoptosis. And they undergo apoptosis because they are far from where nutrition is, which is in the dermis. You see, we only see vascularization. We are seeing blood vessels in the dermis. The epidermis is avascular because it is epithelial tissue. So as the cells move upwards, they are getting further and further away from where the nutrition is, and they start dying. So when we have this layer of cells right here, the cells are more rounded and longer, and some of them don't even have nucleus, and they have lots of granules inside, and these are the cells making up the stratum granulosum. Now above the stratum granulosum we have the stratum corneum, and the stratum corneum is the layer of cells that's closer to the surface of our skin, is the layer of cells that we shed off. Okay, so the order of the layers in the epidermis in this model is stratum corneum all the way to the top, and then we have the stratum granulosum. Below we have the stratum spinosum, and then all the way in the base of the epidermis we have the stratum basale. Okay, awesome. Now, if this was a thick skin model, we would not see hair, and in between the stratum corneum and the stratum granulosum, we would find the 5th layer, right? We would find the stratum lucidum. But since we see hair, that's not the case. We cannot have the stratum lucidum between the stratum corneum and the stratum granulosum. Now, when we look at the dermis, guys, we see that the top layer of the dermis has these indentations, and this is very, very helpful because the epidermis and the dermis, they need to interlock, and it's very hard to separate them if you have these undulations. So when that happens, you have this structure, which is, this is also another skin model, see? And this is where we were talking in the other model, that part right there, the top part of the dermis. And when you look at this, these look like nipples. And nipples in anatomy, they are referred as papilla. And these are the papilla of the dermis. Consequently, these were named dermal papilla. Now, if the top part of the dermis has the dermal papilla, you can remember that the top layer in the dermis is the papillary layer, and consequently the bottom layer of the dermis is the reticular layer. So when we go back to this model, you can see here the dermis, and for convenience we are cutting this in half, and then the top half will be the papillary layer, which is closer to the dermal papilla, and the bottom half is the reticular layer. The reticular layer was named reticular layer because it has lots of reticular fibers, which is one of the fibers produced by fibroblasts that we covered when we studied connective tissue. Awesome. Okay, so now we can look here that we have the hair, and the part of the hair that sticks out that you cannot see in this model would be the hair shaft, and the part of the hair that goes into the skin is what we call hair root. So if you look in this side of the model, what we are seeing is like a sectioned version, and here is the 3D version. So looking here, you would have the hair shaft going outside of the model, and all this that you're seeing going in, this is the hair root, okay? All this is the hair root. And anatomically speaking, if we want to label this part that looks like a bulb, this is the hair bulb. But in your case, in your terminology list, you just have the hair root, which is right here, and then the hair shaft, which would be outside of the skin. Awesome. Now, we know that sometimes when we are cold, we have our hairs sticking up, and that can only happen because we have a muscle that will make it change directions, and then it goes up, which is what we call as goosebumps. So when you look here in the hair, you see that we have a muscle that comes and basically grab this part of the hair, you see? Here is the muscle again, and this muscle makes our hair to stick up, which means that our hair will be erect, and that's why this muscle was named arrector pili muscle. So this is the arrector pili muscle, and this is also the arrector pili muscle. Now we know that papilla means nipple, and when we look all the way down here in the hair bulb, which is this part of the hair root that looks like a bulb, this in reality would look like a nipple, and because of that, that's a papilla, but this is the nipple of the hair. Consequently, this is the hair papilla. Also, we see associated with hair this gland that produces oil, and this gland is what we call sebaceous glands. Now guys, sebaceous glands are always associated with hair. And what I suggest you to do is to remember that if you have very oily hair, your sebaceous glands are working very well, because you only have sebaceous glands associated with hair, and they are the ones making your hair oily. How wonderful, right? So this is the intact sebaceous gland, and here in this part we can see these ducts, because sebaceous glands are exocrine glands, right? And they're the ones that they explode, and all that fat comes from the amount of cell membranes that we have being released with the secretion as well. So remember, the sebaceous glands, they are holocrine glands. The whole thing explodes, and they are one of the types of exocrine glands, the ones that release the secretion using exiting ducts. So if sebaceous glands are exocrine glands, which are the glands that use exiting ducts, we need to find the ducts. And if you look here in this version, you can see that we have exiting ducts, and these are the ducts of the sebaceous glands. And then the oily secretion is basically dumped in the hair root, and then it will go up towards the surface of our skin. When you look in this one, what you see? We see here a sweat gland. And as we mentioned in lecture, sweat gland is producing sweat, and sweat is made by the filtration of our blood plasma. Consequently, you see here the sweat gland, and guess what? You see the blood vessels. Oh, wow. Now, the sweat is produced by the sweat gland. It goes up in the sweat gland duct, and then it's released in the surface of the skin via the sweat gland pore. And right here, you have the sweat gland in a sectioned version, but this is the gland, sweat gland duct, and right here, the sweat gland pore. Awesome. Now, guys, look at this. If I touch the skin and I'm capable of feeling it, that tells me that without much pressure, just touching the skin, I was capable of activating a sensory receptor, a receptor that detects sensation. Now, for me to just touch the skin and be able to activate this sensory receptor, that tells me that this receptor must be closer to the surface of the skin. If this receptor would be all the way down, even in the hypodermis, I would need to put lots of pressure to be able to activate it because it's so deep down. And with that in mind, you can conclude that when you look at the sensory receptors, this one that's close to the surface, this one will be able to be easily activated if I just touch. But for me to activate this one that's all the way deep, I would need to put pressure, right? And that's how you do to remember that these are the tactile corpuscles. Tactile corpuscles detect touch, and they detect, let's say, minor touch. And when you remember that the tactile corpuscle detector minor touch, you make the connection that's minor touch, Meissner corpuscle. The tactile corpuscle is also called Meissner, but I like to say Meissner corpuscle, so you remember minor touch. And this one that's all the way down and looks like an onion and it has several layers, it's called lamellated corpuscle. And the other name for the lamellated corpuscle is Pacini's or Pacinian's corpuscle. And you remember, P for pressure, P Pacini's corpuscle, okay? Now we see in this model free nerve endings, and these free nerve endings should not be all the way up. So we have free nerve endings, and we also see the tactile corpuscles, also named Meissner corpuscle, and this one is the lamellated. It has several layers, lamellated corpuscle, or P for pressure, because you really need to press to activate this one that's down there. P for pressure, P Pacini's corpuscle. In this model, we can see all the structures we saw in the other model. We have here the hair root, all the way this, and then outside of the model, we have the hair shaft. Here we have the hair papilla, arrector pili muscle, sweat gland duct, and all the way up would be the sweat gland pore. What we see as well is the adipocyte and the hypodermis. This is all the dermis. Remember, this is the dermal papilla, which then will tell us that this is the papillary layer, and then the bottom half is the reticular layer. And we see the different layers in the epidermis, and this is the stratum basale, and then we have the stratum spinosum. The stratum granulosum is this dark blue, and then all the way up here, this is the stratum corneum. I hope this video is helpful.